Okay, for this part of the unit, I don't have as fancy a notes as normal. We are just going to freehand them, which means I'm just going to write them on the screen and I need you to write them along with me. So hopefully you are paying attention and you can go ahead and just start writing these with me on a sheet of paper because that's how we're doing notes today. All right, so oh, sorry, trying to pick out my colors here. Okay, so let's start by doing the first problem and we'll talk about some steps. These are going to look a little bit different than what we've done before. So I'm going to give you something that's going to look like this. So we haven't really looked at something like that before. We've talked about factoring and all that, but you know how to undo functions and how to get x by itself. So the first thing we want to look at getting rid of here is getting rid of that exponent. So it's a square. So the opposite of squaring something is square rooting something. We talked about that when we were doing our lessons last week. So we want to square root both sides though, because remember, you can't just do it on one side. You have to do it on both sides. So when we square root a square, we're just left with what's on the inside. You don't need the parentheses because there's nothing else happening. But the square root of 25 is not just 5. It's actually positive and negative 5. And the reason is because 5 times 5 is 25 and negative 5 times negative 5 is also 25. So either of them can be used to get that 25. So we have to give both of them in our answer here. Well, then the next thing we want to do, our goal is always to get x by itself. So we want to add 2 on both sides. But then it leaves you with this little dilemma. X equals 2 plus or minus 5. Well, really what's happening is that's giving us two different answers. It's giving us 2 plus 5 and it's giving us 2 minus 5. Well, that gives us two numerical answers as well. 2 plus 5 is 7. 2 minus 5 is negative 3. So remember how before with factoring we got two answers for x? Well, we still have two answers for x, and that's perfectly fine. And you're going to see that with this factoring, you're going to get two answers for x almost every single time. Okay, the next example I want to do looks something like this. We can't square root this the way it is. We have to deal with the 9 in front first. Well, that 9 is being multiplied by everything, so I want to do the opposite of multiplication, which is division. So we're going to make sure we divide it on both sides. So we're left with x minus 3 all squared equals 4. So now I can get rid of the square by square rooting both sides. So remember, the square root gets rid of the square, so I'm left with x minus 3. And the square root of 4 is going to be plus or minus 2, because remember, you have to have the positive and the negative version. So then to get the x by itself, we add 3 on both sides. Then we're left with x equals 3 plus or minus 2, which means I have 3 plus 2, which is 5, and 3 minus 2, which is 1. So those are both of my x values, and I'm done. But the issue becomes that they aren't always that easy. And I know you're saying, Miss Moore, you always have to make them so difficult. Why do you have to do that? Why can't they just stay easy forever? Why can't life just stay easy forever? But, anyways, so what if we're given something like this? Okay, so I want to solve this by completing the square. And the reason I want to do that is because I know that I can treat this the same way we did when we were getting stuff in vertex form before. And I know it's kind of easy because there's no number out front. So I want to do this by completing the square. So what I'm going to do is I am going to do like we did before where we used the blank. So x squared plus 14x plus blank. So we're imagining like that minus 51 is not there. Then you take 14 and divide it by 2. So I get x plus 7. And then remember, so you divided it by 2 to get here. So you divide that by 2. And we got the 7. And then you take the 7 and you square it. And that gives you that number. So that's 49. Then we've got to say, how do I get from 49 to negative 51? Well, I have to subtract a lot. So I end up subtracting 100 to get there. So then my final thing is going to say x plus 7 squared minus 100 equals 0. But I can't solve it yet. So remember, to solve something, we need this parentheses squared thing by itself. So we're going to add 100 on both sides. So then we get x plus 7 squared equals 100. Well, now it looks just like those other ones we just did. So let's deal with it the same way we dealt with those. So we're going to square root both sides. So the square root of this gives me x plus 7. Square root of 100 is plus or minus 10. Well, then I can just take my next step and minus the 7 on both sides. X equals negative 7 plus or minus 10. Well, I actually need to figure out what that is. So let's do that. Let's figure out what is. Negative 7 plus 10 is going to be 3, and negative 7 minus 10 is going to be negative 17. So those are my two x values. So I solved it. I did it. Now, while I understand there are a few more steps involved here, that happens sometimes. But when I am asking you to solve these by completing the square, there's a reason. Sometimes they're a little bit easier than factoring, and sometimes this is easier for you guys than factoring is. Okay, let's take this one for instance. We are going to look at this and we are going to do completing the square just like we did before. So the very first step, remember, is to act like that last piece isn't there. And then we have to take, this one has a front number, so we have to take that front number out. Then we take 10 and we divide it by 2. So we get x, or negative 10 divided by 2, we get x minus 5, all squared. Don't forget to bring your 2 down here. So what is negative 5 squared? Well, negative 5 squared is positive 25. But remember, you have to take this 2 and distribute it here to be able to get this to be 50. Well, how do I go from 50? How do I go from 50? Sorry. How do I go from 50 to 14? I have to minus 36. So now that I have that, I can take it and I can write it out to the side. 2 times x minus 5 squared minus 36 equals 0. And I can add the 36 to both sides. 2 times x minus 5 squared equals 36. Okay. And now I can divide by 2. So x minus 5 all squared equals 18. Well, now I can do like we've done all these other times and square root both sides, but I'm about to run into a little bit of a problem here. So what I want you to see here is what just happened. When I take the square root of this on the left, I get x minus 5, no problem. But on the right, when I take the square root of 18, is 18 a perfect square? It's not. And honestly, I don't want one of those yucky decimals. So what you're going to have to do, and I know this makes it hard, and I know you're groaning to yourself and going, oh, Miss Moore, I don't want to do that. You need to take square root of 18 and break it down like we did in class last week. 9 times 2, 9 is 3 and 3. Cross out the 9 since we broke it down. We have a pair of 3's. So this becomes 3 root 2. So this equals plus or minus 3 root 2. I will say it does make your final answer just a tiny bit easier. Add 5 to both sides. And the answer is 5 plus or minus 3 root 2. What that crazy answer means is that you couldn't have gotten this by factoring. It means there's two ways to get this: completing the square, which we just did, and what we're going to do the later part of this week. I know this seems a little complex. We're going to do one more example on here for notes, and then we're going to do a bunch of examples in class to hopefully help you feel really solid with this goal or lesson. Okay, last problem here. So the first thing you should notice is that it's not set equal to 0. So we do need to set it equal to 0, move that over. So then we have 5x squared plus 20x plus 13 equals 0. Then I know we move the 13 over to pretend like it's not there, but that's how you got to do sometimes. Sometimes it just be like that. Oh, you don't actually need that equals either. I was starting to write it in. You don't need it. Okay, so what we need to do next is take out the 5. And then we need to take this 4, divide it by 2. We get x plus 2 all squared. Don't forget to bring down your 5. 2 squared is 4. 5 times 4 is 20. And how do I get from 20 to 13? I minus 7. So, and then that whole shebang equals 0. Okay, so let's look at what we have. We have 5 times x plus 2 squared minus 7 equals 0. So I need to add 7. So 5 times x plus 2 squared equals 7. Divide by 5 on both sides. I'm then left with x plus 2 squared equals 7 over 5. On both sides, I then need to take the square root, but I can't really take the square root of 7 over 5, and I can't even simplify it. It's kind of crazy, but that's okay. I'm left with x plus 2 equals plus or minus the square root of 7 over 5. So then I want to finish this off. Very, very last step, minus 2 on both sides. X equals negative 2 plus, good gravy, that is terrible writing. Sorry, y'all. Plus or minus the square root of 7 over 5. And that's it. That's your final answer. That is all you have to do here. I know it looks a little bit crazy. I know it looks a little unorthodox, but that is the actual answer. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that later in the week. Hopefully you didn't get too frustrated. And if you did, please, please, please make sure you come to class and ask questions. I will have more practice problems for us to do in class. See you guys then.